Hold up. Before we dive in, let's talk about your nose. It's been through a lot. Burnt toast, gym socks, whatever your roommate calls dinner. Treat it better with Adulting Candle Company, the brand that turns adulting into self-care. These aren't your basic candles. We're talking crystal-infused, glitter-dusted, hand-poured good vibes in a jar. Do you want your bathroom to smell like a peppermint wonderland? Do you need a candle that screams, "I survived today"? Done and done. Everything's ethically sourced, handmade with love, and packed to make your inner child and your grown-up Bills having self equally happy. So go ahead, light something that smells like healing, or chaos, or cookies, we don't judge. Shop now at adultingcandleco.com and find them on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook at Adulting Candle Co. Because adulting is hard, but at least it can smell amazing. I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. A quick note before the show. World War I Stories Tales Beyond the Trenches is now available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle. You heard that right. I've handpicked 10 stories from the podcast, arranged them into a book, and released Volume 1 to the masses. So if you love these stories and would like to own them in ebook or paperback, simply search for World War I Stories Tales Beyond the Trenches on Amazon. And don't shy away from sharing the podcast or even the book with those who love historical fiction. And now, today's episode, The Signalman. The light of the flare was magnified as it illuminated the sky and reflected off the snow around him. Instinct begged him to be still, to become one with the snow-covered ground. So he did. When the light faded away, he knew he had just moments to cover ground before another flare was sent airborne. He quickly rolled the wooden spool of wire along the ground towards his destination. Earlier in the day, a division had taken a trench system that had been held by the Austro-Hungarian army. Now, he and others were attempting to lay signal wire to that trench, an effort to establish communication between their current position and the new one that had been taken. Another flare illuminated the dark sky, and again he froze. This time, as he turned his head, he found himself staring directly into the eye of a man who had lost half of his face and lay dead, his body slowly being covered by the occasional snow flurries. This was one of the easier jobs, not only because the trench before him had already been taken, but because this stretch of no man's land was not under direct assault. However, the mission was still dangerous. The trench systems were never constructed in a straight line, so not only did the other side have snipers who might have a line of sight to him from another system, but in the darkness, even his own side, the Italian army behind him, wouldn't be able to distinguish him from a foe. When the flare light faded, he proceeded again. The spool rolled over the frozen, snow-covered ground, only being deterred by the occasional rock that blocked its path. It took 2 hours to navigate the distance. Once he arrived, he rolled the spool of wire over the edge of the trench and jumped in after it. Matteo Rossi had started his military service as a message runner. He had exhibited above-average speed and agility during his army training a year ago, and as a result had been trusted to take communication from one army position to another. Now, at the age of 19, he was still ensuring communication could be maintained, just in a different capacity. He removed his pack quickly as soldiers looked on in curiosity. It hit him that many of these men, most from small villages like himself, had probably never seen a telephone, let alone one meant for the field. He quickly pulled the field telephone from his pack along with wire cutters. He cut the wire, and stripped the ends, inserting the wire ends into the terminals on the phone. He rummaged back in his pack for the screwdriver and secured the wire in place. Next came the test. He used the crank generator integrated into the telephone, rotating the crank to send a signal to the other end of the wire that he had connected before traversing no man's land. If all went right, a man at the other end would hear the signal and pick up the receiver. That is exactly what happened. He was in the trench for all of 8 minutes before he started the dangerous trek back, still under the cover of night and amidst the flares. His mind, no longer preoccupied with the mission ahead of him, now drifted homeward. He thought of his mother's cooking, his sister's laugh that he found so annoying yet somehow missed. He wondered how his friends were faring, not just the ones from home, but the ones he met during training, the ones that were fighting somewhere amid this hellish landscape. He thought back to the day he received his conscription notice. Oh, how his mother cried. His sister, too. He liked to imagine that his father would have cried had he not passed away when Matteo was merely 6 years old and his sister was 2. He wondered how they were. Was mother staying up all night worrying? Was his sister doing well in school, or had she had to find work? All these things crossed his mind as he slithered across no man's land, stopping only when the flares lit up the night sky. 2 hours later, he was back where he began, in the relative safety of what was now the rear trench. Overall, he traveled 4 hours for 15 minutes of actual work. Being a linesman in the military did have its advantages, and one of those advantages was nobody questioning him as he made his way through the trench system to the very rear of the line. All in all, about a half-mile away from what used to be the most forward trench. There, he could freely exit the trenches and relax in the grassy meadow nearby, now covered with snow, and take in the beauty of the mountains that loomed over them all. Or he could make his way to the tent he shared with 3 other linesmen, which is what he did now. The bed was not soft nor even remotely comfortable. The tent, even though the fighting was over a mile away, was not quiet by any means. He could still hear the explosions in the distance as well as the rifle and machine gun fire. The noise he heard most often, though, was the ambulances rumbling in and out as well as the moans and cries of the men that have suffered an ill fate. He was almost asleep when he heard the commotion outside. Some yelling, but not in terror. Something was wrong, but it was not life-threatening. He got up to investigate anyway. He stretched as he stepped out of the tent and back into the cold morning. The sun was just above the ridge now, basting the scenery in a mellow orange glow. He looked around as his eyes adjusted to the light. An ambulance was stuck in the mud, its tires spinning in an effort to break free. 4 soldiers stood behind the truck pushing. Behind this ambulance was 4 more, all waiting to move into the position needed to pick up their human cargo. He looked on as one of the men stopped pushing. "Let's get dirt. These tires have nothing to grip." The others stopped pushing as well and nodded in agreement. "No, don't do that," Matteo interjected. All 4 men stopped in their tracks. "Why not? It'll give the tires some traction," one asked him. Matteo pointed at the ground beneath the truck. "Sure, it will at first, but that dirt'll just get wet and add to the mud. Then what? Plus you have these other trucks lined up here. What happens to them when they pull up? They get stuck too. Do you want to spend the rest of your day pushing these trucks out of the muck?" The driver, who had stuck his head out the window and had been listening to the conversation, chimed in. "What do we do then?" Matteo thought a moment. "Rocks may work, but if I were you guys, I would get those." He pointed across the field where some duckboards were stored. Duckboards were what they called the 6 to 8 foot long planks of wood that served as flooring and wall reinforcement in a trench system. They were vital in preventing trench foot and keeping the soldiers from constantly sinking into the mud. They were also vital in keeping the trench walls from collapsing on the men within it. Matteo continued. "Get those duckboards, lay them down in front and behind the wheels, then let's line the entire drive with them so these other trucks don't get stuck. Trust me, it'll save a lot of time, headaches, and maybe he took a moment to gesture towards the awaiting line of injured men who had, until now, been patiently waiting their ride to the field hospital. Maybe save a life, he finished. He led the 4 men to the yard where extra boards were kept. Each man, after grabbing 2 boards, trotted back to the stuck ambulance. Matteo demonstrated, shoving one of the boards under the back tires and then lined the rest of them side by side towards the front, creating what looked like a boardwalk. They continued this process in the front of the vehicle. Then, with an effort, they were able to push the vehicle onto the boards. They then lay more boards down where the tires had been. This allowed the tires to gain traction. The ambulance was now free. Before the other trucks advanced, they lay even more down to assure that no other ambulance got stuck as the ground turned to mud. When finished, Matteo and the others stepped back and watched as a procession of ambulances drove up onto the makeshift road and continued their mission, delivering the wounded to those that could help them. The shell holes and pockmarked ground hid the fact that spring had come and gone. The flowers that had dared to germinate had all been blown away or stomped back into the mud and dirt by advancing infantry who still struggled to gain ground. Matteo was not a fan of the current conditions in which he had to work. It was dusk, and he was highly visible, and he knew it. The sun was slowly sinking behind the mountain range that overlooked the vast valley. Matteo had slowly crawled out on his stomach, a pack of tools and wire tied to his left foot. He had been eating a thin beef stew alone when he was approached by a young runner. "Excuse me, are you a lineman?" Matteo, who had been mid-bite, looked up. "I am." The boy looked nervous. "You're needed up front, but I was told to grab at least 3 linemen. Can you help me?" Matteo set the tin of stew down on a rock nearby and stood. "I can. The other guys are asleep. Let me get them." He excused himself and disappeared into the tent. Inside, he woke his 2 bunkmates, Giuseppe and Rollo. Both were sleepy and immediately questioned why they were being bothered. "Guess we're needed up front." "Meet me outside in 5, he said, and left the tent. When they emerged, they looked bewildered, but they glanced around, quickly found Matteo, and joined him. After a quick nod, the boy, the runner, started to lead them to where they were needed. A critical line had been severed during a bombardment, a line that could not stay broken for long. Not knowing how bad the damage was, leadership had sent for 3 linemen. This needed to be corrected quickly and effectively. Matteo looked behind him, checking on Giuseppe and Rollo. The 3 of them were following the line in an attempt to find the damage. They soon arrived at a shell hole, and the line ended, severed here. The shell hole was at minimum 20 feet in diameter, Matteo thought to himself. It was Rollo who pointed out the other end of the line. It sat buried in mud on the far side of the shell hole. Wisely, the 3 men jumped into the shell hole. It was deep enough to provide cover while they worked, at least 7 feet. This spot had been hit more than once. Giuseppe was the first to vocalize what Matteo had been thinking. "It's getting too dark." "We can't use any light either. No torch, no lantern," Rollo interjected. "We have to work fast." Grabbing the bag at his feet, Matteo opened it and removed a spool of wire cutters, and crimpers. "We're going to have to use tape to shield the crimps, but we can do this." It was Giuseppe who volunteered to crawl from the shell hole and retrieve the severed wire that lay about 4 feet from the far side of the hole. They had smartly grabbed the near side of the severed wire before they hopped in the shell hole. Matteo and Rollo looked on as Giuseppe slowly crawled out of the hole and towards the end of the wire, which by now was buried in mud. They had to keep their heads down to avoid sniper fire, which prevented them from tracking Giuseppe's progress. 2 minutes turned into 5, and then 10. It had grown very dark now. Matteo was starting to wonder what was taking so long when he saw Giuseppe peer into the shell hole. "What took you so long?" he asked. Rollo instinctively put his hand out. "Hand me the wire." Giuseppe reached his hand out. There was no wire, but there was something else. Something dark. Something dripping from his fingers. Blood. A flare lit up the night sky, and what Matteo saw made his blood run cold. Lying next to Giuseppe on his stomach was a German soldier, his rifle pointed into the shell hole. He had probably been following their voices, probably lying in wait, knowing that someone would eventually come fix the line. Before Matteo could issue a warning, a shot rang out. It hit Rollo squarely in the throat. Matteo watched as Rollo grasped at his neck and fell backwards, landing in the mud with a sickly thud. Matteo, running on instinct, unsheathed his pistol as the German turned the rifle on him and prepared to shoot. The pistol was wet and quickly slipped from his hand into the mud below. He bent to pick it up just as the rifle cracked again, the bullet slamming into the mud wall just behind him. There was no time to grab the pistol now. He knew that. He made his way to the other end of the hole as the flare died down and darkness returned. He quickly felt for what he hoped was the edge of the hole where he had entered. When he reached it, he climbed out. He heard the German. Wait, he heard more than the German. He heard Germans. The soldier had not been alone. Matteo knew he had very little time before another flare illuminated the sky, and when that happened, he was a dead man. He ran as fast as he could, hoping he was heading towards safety. He also hoped that one of his own men would not mistake him for an advancing German. The night sky illuminated again. He instinctively hit the ground, but in the few moments in which he had moved, he had been seen. Bullets slammed into the ground around him. He looked around frantically for something, anything that could give him cover. He saw the body of a man, decaying, staring up at the darkening sky. He crawled behind the body just as the bullet slammed into it. The sky went dark again, and he started running once more. Luckily, he had been moving in the right direction. 10 minutes later, he was safely back in the Italian trenches, recounting what had happened to his superiors. They had failed. Communications had not been restored. Giuseppe and Rollo were dead, and Matteo had almost suffered the same fate. He awoke at 3 in the morning. He was dreading what he had to attempt. It had only been 7 hours since the last attempt failed. 2 men were killed, and he had barely escaped with his life. Major Puccinelli had come to his tent to wake him and waited for him now. Matteo slowly rose from the cot. He was still reeling from earlier events, and because of that, he was highly motivated. "You aren't going alone," the major told him. "I'm not taking any other linesmen out there to get killed. I owe that to Giuseppe and Rollo. I need to do this myself." "I get that. You aren't going with other linesmen. I talked to the colonel. We're stacking the deck a bit. That communication needs to be restored, so you're taking 10 infantry guys with you. Plus, we're going to have about 20 or 30 rifles trained on your position. Any movement that is at you guys, it's being taken out. It's dark. How do we know that those guns won't mistake us for Germans and open fire? I appreciate the backup. Just be careful if you could. Please, I'll get this fixed," Matteo said with more confidence than he felt. When he was ready, he left the tent with the major and made his way to the forward trench. The major was true to his word. There were indeed about 40 men waiting for him. The major tried to introduce some of them, but Matteo stopped him. "No names. It's better that way." "Better for who?" asked Puccinelli. Matteo looked him in the eye. "For me." A young man with a Red Cross armband approached the group, a crate of supplies slung against his hip. He moved quickly, but with an ease Matteo had not seen in most of the new arrivals. He passed out canteens and hardtack wordlessly. When he reached Matteo, he held out a canteen. "You look like you could use it," the young man said with a tired half-smile. Matteo took it. "Thanks." An American. That kid's an American, he thought to himself. The boy gave a quick nod, adjusted the strap across his shoulder, and moved on. Matteo opened his bag, slipped the canteen inside, tied the bag to his left leg once again, and crawled out of the trench. This time, accompanied by an armed entourage. Command really wanted this communication line repaired, he thought to himself. This time, the task was uneventful. When a flare went up, they froze. When it was dark, they moved. They followed the same line just as before, and Matteo jumped into the same shell hole. Both Giuseppe and Rollo's bodies were right where he had left them. There were no Germans in sight this time. He wondered why. Why had they been lying in wait earlier, and why not now? He quickly realized that it didn't matter. He had a job to do. He utilized two of the infantrymen. One man crawled out and retrieved the broken piece of line that had been Giuseppe's death trap. Another held a lantern that had one side painted black. This would allow light from one side but not allow others to see it. It took a half hour for Matteo to splice the broken ends with a new piece of wire and connect the line again. This time, he did not have a phone or any way to test the line. He had to hope for the best. As they started out of the shell hole, he looked down at Rollo's body, then over at Giuseppe's. He glanced over at the infantryman next to him. "We should take them back with us." The infantryman nodded. He whispered to another, who whispered to another, and the word spread. Soon, the men were carrying the bodies back, still having to quickly get down when the flares lit up the night sky. 2 hours later, Matteo was back in his tent, laying on his cot. He cried himself to sleep. The late June sun was high in the sky when he emerged from his tent. The cacophony of battle, which had become a staple of daily life, somehow felt more prominent these days, as if it had grown more intense, if not closer. Ambulances were again lined up to receive the injured and the dead. He suspected this was a never-ending sight at the rear of any trench system. He looked on as one ambulance pulled away from the front of the line and watched as the others moved forward. All but one. One sat tilted at an angle, and the vehicles behind it began to go around. He saw that a young man, was changing a tire on the disabled vehicle. The man wore a Red Cross armband, like the others, but he looked familiar to Matteo. It was the same young man who had given him the canteen a few weeks back, just before he went over the top to repair the line. Matteo moved in to help him. The driver had already engaged the handbrake, Matteo saw, and had chocked the tires with large rocks. That was important. He didn't want the vehicle to move and possibly hurt himself or someone else. "Let me give you a hand." The young man looked up. He had been placing the screw jack, which was what had lifted the vehicle to the peculiar angle that Matteo had first noticed. "Thanks. Can you hand me that wheel wrench? It's on the passenger seat." "Sure thing." Matteo circled the vehicle and opened the opposite door. The wheel wrench tumbled out of the vehicle and landed on the ground, missing his foot by an inch. This must have been due to the angle that the screw jack lifted the vehicle to, he thought. He handed the man the wrench, and the man got to work loosening the lug nuts that had secured the tire to the axle. After he removed the fifth lug nut, he removed the tire and rolled it aside. It almost ran right into Matteo's tent, but instead came to rest near the quartermaster's quarters. He was still on his knees when he looked up at Matteo. "There's a spare in the back. Do you mind grabbing it?" Without a word, Matteo did just that and brought the spare back to him, then looked on as the man secured the tire, loosened the screw jack, tossed the wrench through the window and back into the cab of the truck. He quickly shook Matteo's hand. "Thank you." Then he got into the truck and retook his place in the line. It had been a quiet 2 weeks, at least for him, but not for the camp. Every day it felt like the shelling was getting closer, and the ambulances were an ever-present sight, moving in and out, carrying away the dead and wounded. He saw the young American ambulance driver often lately. They were cordial, exchanging subtle nods and sometimes the occasional wave. He saw him now, near the front of the line of ambulances, close to the entry of the trench system. Soon he would have a man loaded up and be on his way. Today, Matteo planned on heading into the trenches a bit. Not too far, just enough to gather information. How was the communication line holding up? Was there anything he needed to fix? Was there anything else he could do to help? He was bored. He made his way toward the entrance and noticed the American ambulance driver walking behind him. He had a basket of supplies on his arm. Then it dawned on him. The kid wasn't driving an ambulance today. He was the supply man. Matteo noticed Major Puccinelli just ahead and stopped to address him. The ambulance driver with the basket brushed past and kept walking. Puccinelli was busy discussing some supply demands with the quartermaster. That was fine. Matteo would wait. That was when he heard the loud whistle in the air. The concussive thump filled his ears. The air became hot all around him. Gravity seemed to fail. He flew backwards into the trench wall and fell to the floor, the duckboards cracking under his weight. He opened his eyes. He could barely make anything out through the debris, dust, and flames. Pain shot through his arm, his side, and his left leg. Above him appeared the ambulance driver. He said something, but Matteo could not hear him. There was blood on the driver's leg, both legs. He felt himself being moved. Then the world went dark. He lay there in bed, bandages wrapped around what was left of his arm, his leg, and his torso. It was painful to move, but the doctor said he would live. He would probably be sent home now, of course. His left arm had been amputated at the elbow. What use would he be to the army now? He didn't remember what had happened, but he recognized the man in the bed next to him. It was the American ambulance driver. He had been told that Major Puccinelli had perished in the blast along with the quartermaster he had been speaking to. Only that 3 feet of difference had stood between Matteo and certain death. He had been lucky. He had also been told that the ambulance driver, even though badly injured himself, had found the strength to carry him out. It was no secret in the infirmary that Matteo owed his life to this nameless ambulance driver. The man had selflessly carried him to the trench entrance and thrown both Matteo and himself into the first ambulance he saw before losing consciousness. Now, 3 days later, the young man still had not come around. Matteo hoped that he would soon. That's when the man stirred, his breathing getting heavier, and he sat straight up. Matteo sat in his chair on the portico watching some children kick a ball in the dusty street. The pain had eased a little in the 3 months since he'd come home. One change he was still working to get used to was the constant, unsettling sensation of a phantom arm that was no longer there. There had been many other changes since he had been home. In fact, people around the world were still celebrating the armistice that had ended the war last month, on November 11th. He had started to learn how to do his daily routine without his left hand, and he was getting ready to start an apprenticeship under a popular chef in town. Often he thought back to his time in the hospital and the ambulance driver. They had been in the same room for 2 weeks before they had both been sent home. They talked a lot, laughed a little, and cried some. They had become friends. Matteo was glad he was doing well. He held the letter in his hand. It was the second one he had received from the American. But this time it was different. The young man had expressed his desire to become a writer, and Matteo hoped he would be a good one. Matteo could not help but smile, thinking that, if, by chance, this American became famous, Matteo already had his autograph. He looked down at the letter and read the signature again. Sincerely, Ernest Hemingway. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. If this episode stayed with you, if it stirred something quiet or left you in stillness, share it, follow the show, leave a rating, help keep these stories alive. Our first collection now lives on Kindle. Search World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, Volume 1 in your Kindle app, and carry these echoes with you. For glimpses behind the curtain and stories between the stories, join me on Instagram at WWIPod_HennyB. And if you'd like to see your name in the credits, become a producer. Visit our Patreon at patreon.com/World War I Stories and help power the next tale into existence. Thank you for walking back in time with me.